The workbench is the most important and utilized tool in the shop. That's why it's important to have one to fit your specific need and space. Today I'm going to show you how I build a perfect workbench for my one-car garage shop, full of storage, power, and functionality. I had this pile of wood that I call a workbench for over a year now, and I think it's time that I finally make myself a solid workbench. As you can see, this thing was not stable at all. It had a lot of wasted space for storage, and the top wasn't even secured to the legs. To make my new workbench, I'm going to be using 2x4s and plywood. I will also be reusing the MDF top by flipping it over to get a clean side. Let me know down in the comments if you'd be interested in plans for this workbench. Since almost no one likes rounded edges of construction lumber, I gave them a quick pass on the table saw to remove them. In order to make this workbench solid, I'm going to be using half-lap joinery. I laid out 4 pieces that make one side and marked them out for my joinery. I can then repeat this step on all of my 2x4s that are going to be the same. Using a crosscut sled, I removed all the material that was needed for my half-laps. A data blade would have made this much faster, but I do not own one. After my first piece, I realized that I did not need to remove all the material on my table saw. I could just make enough cuts to remove the rest with a hammer and clean it up with a chisel. The stretchers that connect the two ends are too long to cut half-laps on the table saw. I had to use my miter saw with the trenching feature to get the same result. Just make sure to add a scrap 2x4 in between your fence and your workpiece. This will make sure your blade cuts all the way through your workpiece. I could have easily used a few clamps and not screws, but I'm impatient. So I added a few screws and kept on working. Once the two sides of the workbench had enough time to dry, I connected the long stretchers using some glue and screws to secure it. So the frame is done here. As you can see, I added some wheels with brakes off camera because there's no need to explain that. You basically just screw it in from the bottom. I guess I just explained it for you. Using a 2x4 clamp to the bottom of my workbench, I can set the bottom plywood panel in place. I secured it with pocket holes, and same thing goes for the sides. Everything was secure with pocket screws. Using some spacers, I set my middle dividers in place. I cut my MDF top off camera, and after admiring my work, I could finally give it the ultimate test. Yep, I could get used to this. I cut down some plywood to make 6 drawer boxes for one side of the workbench. A lot of scrap wood was used to make these, so they will be a bit different for me. Honestly, it's good enough for shop furniture. I decided I wanted to give my drawer fronts a bit more character, so before cutting all of my drawer fronts out of this piece of plywood, I scored the top of the plywood using my track saw. I did this on a build before and I absolutely love how it came out. Once I had my accent done, I was able to cut my fronts to size. I then had to drill for my cabinet hinge. Luckily, Craig sells these really handy jigs that make it super easy to do. I'll have a link down below in the description. And I know my door is warped a lot, but because of the matching pattern of fronts, I cannot just use a new piece unless I replicate it. The outcome of the decision was that the door would not close, and to fix that, I decided to add a door catch to the inside of the door to hold the door closed. Using some playing cards, I spaced out my drawer fronts and secured them temporarily with some screws using the holes I had made for my hardware. I could then add screws to the inside of my drawers to secure my fronts to the drawer boxes. Now, because it's taken me over a year to finish this workbench, I changed out a few things. The first thing was, I wanted to cut off this overhang at the edge of my workbench. Using the track saw and belt sander made quick work of this. Doing this gives me the ability to add hardwood to the side of my workbench, and I'll explain why I need that in a little bit. I also added hardwood down the side of my workbench, but this time I just clamped it in place while the glue dries. Using a router with a flush trim bit, I flushed up the new hardwood edge to the top of my MDF top. I also used a small handsaw to cut off the extra overhang on each side. Another thing I changed was the top. Originally, I was going to leave it as is, but after watching a few workbench videos, I decided to add a melamine sheet to the top. I did this for 2 reasons. First, I figured this would be more durable as a workbench top. The second reason was this workbench is going to be in almost all of my videos. I might as well make it look nice. I applied contact cement to the top of the workbench and the laminate sheet, letting them both dry completely. With some help of plywood spacers, I slowly began to bond the two together. Since I had left the melamine sheet way oversized, I flushed it to the bench with the router, sanding the edges by hand to soften them up. A lot of people use T-Track on their workbench build, but that could get super expensive. For a fraction of the cost, you could literally have unlimited T-Track just by going with Micro Jig's Match Fit setup. You just route a dovetail group wherever you want without having to buy it and cut more T-Track. The dovetail groove you make becomes your T-Track. And because you already own the bit, you could literally make as many grooves as you want. If you have OCD, look away now. I have my straight edge set up to cut my first dovetail on my workbench, and somehow I managed to clamp it down crooked. It is not 90 degrees to the edge of the workbench. Using a smaller straight bit, I removed most of the material. That way the dovetail bit wouldn't have to remove as much on one pass. I still needed to add some storage to the other side of the workbench, so I threw together some drawer boxes and cut some fronts out of better plywood. Now at this point I have a very functional and solid workbench, but I want to add a few goodies and make this workbench work for me. Now because this workbench is in the center of my shop and it's going to be in a lot of my videos, I'm going to be painting it. The color I went with is Grizzle Gray by Sherwin-Williams in a flat finish. Have I mentioned how much I dislike applying paint to surfaces? I would rather watch paint dry than to paint. If this color looks familiar, you're probably one of the few people that watch my DIY accent wall video, because this is the same color but in exterior paint. It's going to do much better with dirt, stain, and peeling. Oh, by the way, 1 gallon of paint was way too much for this workbench. I used about maybe 15% of the gallon, and that was after giving everything 2 coats. Don't worry, this paint will be used in my next video when I build myself a new miter station. You don't want to miss that one. I can guarantee you've never seen a miter station like this before. One of the goodies I wanted to add to my workbench was this giant toilet paper holder, just in case I ever get any kickback on my table saw and shit my pants. All jokes aside, this contractor paper holder is going to help me protect my top from all the messy glue ups. Plus, it's super easy to make if you measure correctly. My first attempt was a failure, but that was an easy fix. I just added another piece of plywood to give me the clearance that I needed. Another thing I'm going to add is going to be some electrical outlets. Now I am no electrician, so I'm going to make this as basic as possible with stuff you could buy off Amazon. I picked up this electrical outlet receptacle. This will make it super easy to add power to the inside of the workbench while also making it very easy to unplug when I need to move the workbench around. Because my workbench is inside the garage, there's a small possibility that it could get wet. Because of that, I'm going to be using this waterproof recessed power strip on the side of my workbench. This will give me easy access to an outlet while I'm using things like my jigsaw or my sander. No more tripping over cords. So I still have a lot of empty space in this workbench, which is great. I have 2 empty cabinet doors, one on each side of the workbench. I'll fill these spots in as I need them and my junk collection grows. Adding paint to the dovetail tracks did add more friction, so I don't recommend you do that. I'm going to try to add some wax to it and see if that helps. If not, I'm hoping the normal wear and tear will help it slide better. If you like shop build videos like this, then go ahead and click on this one. You're really gonna love this one. I'll just lay right here. I'm too tired after this one.